Today, we're going to build your very first REST API as quickly as possible. Let's get started now. Now, in order to create this REST API, we're going to be using Node.js, Express, and MongoDB. And in order to get started with that, we first need to run npm init. So we can just type in npm init, and we just want to hit enter a bunch of times in order to get all the default values. And as soon as we do that, it's going to create a package.json for us. Next, we want to install all the dependencies that we're going to use. So our dependencies, we can just type npm I, and our first dependency is going to be Express, and then the next dependency that we're going to be having is Mongoose, which is going to allow us to interact with MongoDB easily. Express is really useful for when we want to create an application using Node.js because it's just much easier to create a web application using Express than standard Node.js. Next, we want to use npm to install our development dependencies, so we can say npm I, and we just want to say -- save dev, which is going to make these be development dependencies that do not get installed in production. And we want to use .env, and we also want to use nodemon. Now .env is going to allow us to pull in environment variables from a .env file, and nodemon will allow us to refresh our server every time we make changes without having to manually end it and restart it. Now that we have all those installed, let's remove this test script and create our own script called dev_start, which will allow us to start our server using nodemon. And we just want to type in nodemon, followed by the name of our script, which we're just going to call server.js. We can save that and actually create that new file called server.js. And here we go. This is where we're going to put all of our different server code. And before we get started any further, we want to create that .env folder file right here. And this is going to have our environment variables. And we also want to create a .gitignore, since we're going to be storing this on Git using GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever you want to use. And we want to ignore our .env file, since that's going to have sensitive information. And we also want to ignore our node modules folder, because this can be installed and created by just running npm install whenever you download the code from GitHub or wherever it's stored. Now with that out of the way, let's create our actual server. And the first thing we want to do is we want to require Express. So we'll just create a variable which is called require Express, just like that. And that's going to pull in the Express library. Next, we want to create a variable called app. And we just want to run Express function just like this. And that's going to create an app variable which we can use to configure our server. Next, we can just say app.listen, tell what the port we want to listen on, in our case 3000, and we're just going to pass it a function here, and this gets run whenever our server gets started. So we're just going to log out that our server was started, so we'll say console.log, and we'll just want to say that the server has started. Now if we save that, and we run that method that we created earlier, which is npm run dev_start, hit enter, and this is going to start up our server using nodemon, and as you can see, it says server started down here. And we can go to this app localhost 3000 and our server is going to be running there, but right now it doesn't do anything. So let's make our application actually do something. Next, we want to configure Mongoose to connect to our MongoDB database. So we're going to require that library. We'll just call it Mongoose, and we're going to type in require Mongoose, which again is going to require the library Mongoose and allow us to set it up. The next thing we need to do is actually connect to our database. So we'll type in Mongoose connect, and we want to put in here the string which is our database connection. And in our case, this is going to be MongoDB : //, and then it's going to be localhost, since we're on localhost, and then again /, and we want to type in whatever our database name is going to be called. And we're just going to call this subscribers, because this is going to be a database that holds subscriber information, which is what our REST API is going to handle. And then after that's done, we can just save this. And you can see down here, we get this deprecation warning saying use new URL parser true needs to be passed in because the old one is deprecated. So what we can do is we can pass that option in to the end of our connect just like this. Now if we save that, you see that that warning message goes away and we have nothing else to worry about. Also, what we can do is we can actually create a variable here called db, which is going to be equal to mongoose.connection. And from here, we can hook up some events to run when our database is connected to, so we know it's working correctly. We can just say db.on. And what we want to do is on error, we want to log out that there's an error. So we'll just say here, this is going to take a function with an error. And we can come in here and say console.error. And we can pass it that error. This will just allow us to see if there's a problem connecting to our database. Also, what we want to do is once we connect, so we'll say db.once, which means this will only run once. And whenever we open the database, what we want to do is we want to console.log, saying that we've opened the database. So we can just say connected to database, just like that. And now when we save, we should get the message down here saying connected to database, and that's perfect. But one thing that you'll notice immediately is that we have our MongoDB database string inside of our application. And when we deploy our application, we're going to want to use something that's not our localhost. So we need to pull this out into an environment variable. So let's remove this right here, go into our .env. We can just create a variable, which we're going to call database URL, and we want to set that equal to our MongoDB library right here. And now inside of our server, we can come in here and use process.env.database URL, or just whatever you name this inside of your .env folder, and this will pull from our .env. But you'll notice we get an error, and that's because we need to use the .env library. So all the way at the beginning, we can say require.env, and all we need to do after we require this is call the config method. So we'll just say .config, and this is going to load all of our environment variables from our .env. Now when we save that, you'll see we no longer get an error down here, and it says we connected to our database successfully. So now we have our database completely done, our server is completely hooked up and listening. All we need to do is actually create routes for our server and also set up our server to accept JSON. So let's first set up our server to accept JSON. We can just say app.use, which will allow us to use any middleware that we want, which is essentially code that runs when the server gets a request, but before it gets passed to your routes. And what we want to do is we want to use express.json. And this essentially just lets our server accept JSON as a body instead of a post element or get element or whatever. Also, what we want to do is we want to set up our routes. So since we're going to have a subscriber API, we're going to have some routes that are going to be called subscribers routes. Whoops, subscribers router. There we go. Whoops, I cannot spell. Subscribers router. There we go. And this is going to route all of our subscriber information. And we can just say require. And this is going to be inside of a folder inside of our application called routes. And it's just going to be called subscribers. So we can create that now. Let's create a new folder. This is going to be called routes. And inside of this folder, we want to create a file, which is going to be called subscribers.js. It just needs to match the name that we added in here for subscribers right here. Now, once we have that, we can go in here and tell our app that we want to use that route. So we can say app.use. We pass it the path we want, which in our case, we want to use this whenever we query subscribers. So our URL is going to look like this, localhost 3000/subscribers. And this is going to be right here, this URL. Everything that has this URL or anything after it is going to go into this subscribers router, which we created right here. So now that we have that done, we need to actually tell it we want to use the subscribers router, and there we go. Our application is set up and working, and you'll see that we get an error. And this is because our router.use requires middleware. This subscriber router right now is absolutely nothing. This is completely blank. So let's set that up. We again need to use Express, so we're going to say require Express in here. And this is because our entire application uses Express. And what we want is we want the router portion of Express. So we can just say express.router, and this is going to get us the router from Express. And for now, all we want to do is export that. So we can say module.exports is going to equal to router. This is just going to fix our errors down here. And as you can see, we no longer get any errors and everything's working fine, but we have no routes actually configured yet. Since this is going to be a RESTful API, we're going to use RESTful endpoints. And if you don't already have a strong grasp of what REST is and what RESTful endpoints are, I have a really short video going over REST in depth, which you can check out in the cards and the description linked below. So now let's start creating our different routes. We're going to want some routes for getting all subscribers. We're going to want a route for getting one. We're also going to want a route for creating one. We're going to want a route for updating a single one. Whoops, updating one. And we're also going to want a route here for deleting one. And let's configure those routes. To do that, we can just say, router.get, for example, which is going to be get. And to get all, we just want to use this Blake path right here. And of course, all of these are going to take a request and a response, and that is going to be a function. And inside of here, we're going to do all of our code for our different routes. So let's get all of these routes created. For getting one, we're going to want an ID in here. And with a colon in front of it like this, this means that this is a parameter that we can access by typing in request.params. And this would be, params.id, and this would give us access to whatever they pass in after the first slash. Next, we want to create our create route. And this is going to be a post instead of a get, so we can say .post. And again, we're not going to need an ID here since they're not actually going to be creating it with an ID. They're going to be creating it on just the general route. Next, we need to do update. So coming down here, and we're going to be using patch instead of put for our update because we only want to update based on what the user passes us. If they only pass us the name of the subscriber, we only want to update the name and none of the other information about the subscriber. Because if we used put, it would update all the information of the subscriber all at once, instead of just the information that gets passed. Now lastly, we want to create our delete route, which is going to be extremely self-explanatory. This is just going to be delete And again, we need an ID here, as well as on the patch route, we're going to need an ID. And this is the basic shell of all of the different routes that we're going to create. Now, in order to test these routes, let's create in here just a res.send, which is just going to send text down to the server. And we're just going to say hello world, so that we know that we actually have called this get route here for getting all of our subscribers. And normally to test these, you may go into the browser and open it up, but you can't really test a REST API very well in a browser because you have nothing to interact with. So what we're going to use is we're going to use an extension in Visual Studio Code. And this extension is called right here, REST Client. It has 2 million downloads, it's incredibly great, and it allows you to call a REST API directly from Visual Studio Code. You can also use a program such as Postman if you want to instead, but I really like being able to do this directly in Visual Studio Code. So what we want to do is we want to create a path here, a file, which is going to just be called route.rest. You can call it whatever you want, it just has to end in either .rest or .http. And in here, we can create our request. So in our case, we want to create a GET request, and we want this GET request to go to http://localhost 3000, and we want it to be in the subscribers. So we're going to say /subscribers. Whoops, that added a little bit more than I wanted. And this is actually going to request that route that we just set up right here, our get all route. And what we can do is we can just click send request, and it's going to send that request. And as you see, we get hello world back. At the top here, we have all of the different headers and statuses. We can pretty much ignore this for the most part. But down here is going to be the actual content of the request that we get sent. So as you can see right here, we got hello world. And if we go into this one, we can do res.send, and we want to send the request.params.id, for example. And we can make a request to that in our routes.rest. We can even do multiple. So if we just add in here 3 hashtags, and then we do another route, this will separate these into 2 different requests. And we can do an ID, let's say 12, for example. We click send, and we get that ID 12 back, change it to 15, and we get 15 back. So we know that our routing is working, and we're able to call it directly from Visual Studio Code. Now with all that out of the way, let's actually create our model that we're going to use for our application. So we can create a folder called models, which is going to hold our model, which is going to be a subscriber model. So we'll just call it subscriber.js. And in here, we're going to be using Mongoose. So we're going to require Mongoose, call it Mongoose equals require, and again, Mongoose. And this is going to allow us to create a model which we can use to interact with the database in a really easy way. So what we want to do is we want to create a schema. We're just going to call this our subscriber schema. Whoops, cannot spell. There we go. And we're going to set this equal to a new mongoose.schema. And this is going to take in here a JavaScript object. And this object is going to have keys for all the different properties of our subscriber. In our case, we're going to have a name, and this is going to have an object as a value. We'll fill it in later. It's going to have a subscribed to channel. So this is who the user is subscribing to, which again, we're going to fill in the details later. And lastly, we're going to have a subscribe date. And this is just going to be the date that they subscribe to the channel. And again, this is going to take a value in here. And it looks like I spelled this incorrectly. There we go. And what we want to do instead of here is actually define the different properties for our schema. So we want to put the type. In our case, the name is going to be a type of string, and we always want the name to be required. So we're just going to have required true here. We're going to do the exact same thing for the subscribe to channel. It's going to be a string, and it's always going to be required. And then lastly, we have our date. This is going to be a type of date. It's going to have a required of true as well, because we always want to have the date they subscribed. But lastly, we want to default this. So we're just going to use here default, and we want to set this to date.now. So if we don't pass a subscribe date, it's just going to default it to the current date. Now with that schema created, we can go down here, we can export that. So we can say module.exports. We want to set that equal to mongoose.model. And now this model function takes 2 properties. The first is the name of the model in our database. In our case, we're going to call it subscriber. And the next is the schema that corresponds to that model, which in our case is subscriber schema. And the reason we need this model function is because when we export this and import it in a different file, this model allows us to interact directly with the database using this schema, which is perfect. So now let's save that, go into our subscriber.js here, and we can include that. So we can say subscriber is going to be equal to require. We want to require back one folder in the models folder subscriber. And now this is going to pull in our subscriber, which we created in this model here. And this is where the fun really begins. So let's do our first get all route, because this is about the easiest one. We're going to use async await in order to do this. So if you don't understand async await, I have a video linked in the cards and description, which you can check out. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this all in a try catch, just like this. And inside the try, we're going to get all of the different subscribers from our model. So we're going to say const subscribers is going to be equal to our subscriber model. find, and this is just going to get all of the different subscribers, and we need to make sure we await this because this is an asynchronous method. So if we await this, as soon as it's done executing, we're going to get all the subscribers here in this method. But if, for example, there's an error, we want to make sure that we catch that error. So if there is an error, we want to send that to the user, and we want to send it as JSON because this is a JSON API. And in here, we're just going to send a message, which is going to be error.message, just like that. And we also want to make sure we set the status so the user know that it was a failure. So we can say .status, and here we want to send the status code. In our case, we're going to send a status code of 500. Now, a 500 status code means that there's an error on your server. It means that the actual server, in our case, our database, had some kind of error which caused the actual transaction not to work, and it had nothing to do with the actual user or client using the API. It was entirely our fault. That's what 500 means, and any error code that's in the 500 range means that. Now, if we actually were successful, we want to send this using JSON. We just want to send all the subscribers to the user. Now we can go in here, we can test our route, and we should get back just an empty array. And as you can see, that's exactly what we get. We get an empty array because we have no subscribers yet. So let's create our create route so that we can actually add subscribers and see what it looks like. We'll scroll down to that, and we're also going to make this an asynchronous function because we're going to be trying to save that model, which is an asynchronous observation. So we want to create a variable called subscriber, set it equal to new subscriber, and this is just going to take a JavaScript object. First thing we want to set is the name, and this is going to come from the request from the body. So the body is whatever the user sends to us, which is going to be JSON, and we want to get the name property of the body. We want to do the same thing with the subscribed to channel, and we want to set this to the request.body.subscribe to channel. And let's close out of this request here. And there we go, that's our subscriber created, but now we actually need to save that. And that's where the asynchronous part comes in. So we're just going to wrap this in a try catch again. And we want to catch that error, of course. And inside of the try here, what we want to do is we want to try to save our subscriber. So we're going to say new subscriber is going to be equal to awaiting the subscriber, which we just created, .save. And this is going to try to persist that to the database. And if it's successful, it's going to put it into this new subscriber variable. And if it is successful, we want to send this to our user using JSON. So we'll say new subscriber. And we also want to set a specific status here. We want to set a status of 201. And the status 201 means successfully created an object. By default, if you don't send any status, it sends a status of 200, which means everything was successful. But 201 is just a more specific way to say that you created something. So when you're using the post route, you always want to make sure to send 201 when you're successful instead of 200. Now let's catch that error. So we want to say res.status. And this time we're going to send a status of 400 instead of 500. And this is because our thing is going to fail here if the user doesn't pass in the name or they don't pass in a subscribed channel, for example. So if the user gives us bad data, it'll fail. And whenever the user gives you bad data, the client, you want to send a 400 error because that means there's something wrong with the user input and not something wrong with your server. And of course, we want to send that error message to them. So we'll say .json error.message. And of course, we want to make sure we wrap this in an object just like that. And there we go. We can save that. And now let's actually test that. So down here, make sure we put in our 3 hashtags, and we want to do a post route. And we want to post to essentially the same exact place, HTTP localhost 3000 subscribers. And that's exactly perfect. And now to send data to it, we need to make sure we leave a blank line here, and then here we can put our JSON. So let's type it in. We want to send a name. Whoops, make sure it's in quotes. Name, and we want this person to be amazing person is their name. And the subscribe to channel. Whoops, type that out correctly. Subscribed to channel is of course going to be web dev simplified because all of my subscribers are amazing people. Web dev simplified, and there we go. And now that we want our server to know that this is going to be JSON that we send to it, so we need to set the content type to be application/JSON. Now we can click send request, and you'll see that we get a message that says subscriber validation failed, subscriber to channel path subscriber to channel is required. And this means I spelled something wrong. I spelled subscribe to channel as subscriber to channel. So let's see where I did that. We can just do a search all, hit enter. And it looks like in here in our schema, I just misspelled this. It should be subscribed to channel instead of subscriber to channel. Now let's go back and test our route. We can click send request again, and you see that we get our model back. It has an automatically generated ID as well as the name, subscribe to channel, and subscribe date, which you can see is set to whatever the current date that I'm recording this is. And if we don't pass in the name, for example, and we hit send request, we're going to get back that error message, and you'll also notice we get that 400 status, which says bad request, which is perfect because it'll come back as an error to the user using our API. Let's plug that back to how it was so that we have a successfully working API. Now let's go back to our route here, and you may notice that all of the rest of our routes are going to be taking an ID. Our update, our delete, as well as our get all have an ID that we're going to pass to it, and they're all going to do the exact same code at the beginning in order to get the subscriber. So instead of writing that code in every single one of our routes, we're going to use what's called a middleware. So we're going to create a function which will be that middleware. And these functions have the exact same syntax as this function right here. We're going to call this one get subscriber, because essentially that's all it's going to do. It's going to take an ID and get us a subscriber. And as I mentioned, it has request, response, and next as the final property. And essentially all that this next function does is it says, if we call this, move on to the next section of our code, which is going to be this callback right here. And this is what the middleware is. And of course, we're going to make this asynchronous because we're going to be accessing the database inside of this code. And now, of course, we want to wrap everything inside of a try catch. So we'll put the try right here. And of course, we want to catch our error. And now inside of this try, we want to get a subscriber. So we're just going to say subscriber is going to be equal to awaiting the subscriber dot find by ID. And this, all we have to do is pass an ID, which as you remember, I said that request dot params dot ID is going to be correlating to the variable that they pass inside of the route here. So this is going to try to get a user based on the ID that they pass us inside of the URL. And then what we can do is we can check to see if that subscriber actually exists. So we can say subscriber equals null. So if the subscriber does not exist, what we want to do is we want to return here, and we want to set the status right here to be equal to 404. And a 404 status means that you could not find something, and which is exactly what happened in our case. We're not able to find the subscriber. And then of course we want to send back a message so the user knows that. Whoops. So we'll send back a message here, and this message is just going to say cannot find subscriber. There we go. Now that we have out of the way, let's actually create our subscriber up here. We're just going to default this to undefined. And what we want to do is we want to set our response.subscriber. This is just a variable we're creating on the response object. We're going to set that equal to subscriber. And this way, inside of all of these other functions, we can just call res.subscriber right here. And this is going to be the subscriber that we set down here. So let's leave that now. And the reason we're calling return here is because if there is no subscriber, we want to immediately leave this function and no longer go any further. And inside of this catch here, we just want to do essentially the same thing. We want to do a return. We want to set the status. In this case, it's going to be a 500 because there's something wrong with our server that's causing this problem. And we want to send that message back to the user. So we're going to say message is going to be equal to error.message, just like that, which is perfect. And then lastly, that next function we want to call all the way down here because we successfully completed this entire getSubscriber function. So next will allow us to move on to the next piece of middleware or the actual request itself. So now let's use that getSubscriber middleware. We'll go up here and all you do is put it before your actual function. You don't actually call it, you just put the name of that function right there, and that'll be your entire middleware set up. Now inside of here, we can say that we want to send the request response.subscriber.name, for example. And if we save that, since we have this getSubscriber in here, this is actually going to get the name of the subscriber and send it back to us. This is just for testing purposes. So let's get all of our subscribers here. We'll send a request. We're going to take an ID, and we want to use that inside of this request to get a single subscriber. And if we click on that, you'll see that we get the name of that subscriber, which is Amazing Person. And that's perfect. If, for example, we send a different ID, which does not exist, and we click send, you'll see we get a message that says cannot find subscriber. So we know that our middleware that we created is working. So now we can apply that middleware to the rest of all of our routes. So let's copy this down, do this inside of here. And we also want to do this inside of here for our deleting. Let's exit out of this so we have a little bit more room to work with. And now we can actually create our route right here for getting one. And this is really straightforward. All we want to do is send that actual subscriber. So we'll say res.subscriber. And this is just going to send us a JSON version of that subscriber. And of course, we can try calling that right here. And you'll see we get the JSON version of that back, which is perfect. Now back to our routes, we can work on the delete route because that one's also really straightforward. We want to make sure this is asynchronous because we're going to be calling this using try catch. So let's set up that try catch just like that. And we of course want to be able to catch an error in here if something, for example, happens. And inside of here, all we want to do is we just want to await res.subscriber.remove. And this is just going to try to remove that subscriber from the database. And if it fails, we're going to get an error down here, which we can just send back a status of 500 because something obviously is wrong on our end if we get an error trying to remove it. And we'll just want to send back the message as the error.message. And if we did successfully remove the subscriber, we can just send back some JSON that says that we did that. So we can just say in here, we want to send a message that says deleted subscriber. So now let's try to call that. We can just come down here, separate it with 3 hashtags, just like this. And we want to call delete, and we just want to call it on the route up here for the user with the correct ID. So let's copy that down. And let's call send request, and you'll see message deleted subscriber. And if we try it again, you'll see cannot find subscriber because we deleted that subscriber. And if we try to get all of our subscribers, we now get an empty array again because no more subscribers exist. So let's send that request to add a new subscriber back. So we have at least 1 subscriber here, as you can see, inside of our database. So we can use that with our new patch route that we're going to be creating now. Now, in order to update, we need to, as I said, only update for things that actually are sent to us in the request. So what we want to do is we want to check the request. We can say if the request.body.name is not equal to null. So if the user actually passed a name to us, we want to take that res.subscriber and we want to set the name equal to the request.body.name. And we want to do the exact same thing, but we're going to do this for the subscribed to channel. So in here, we'll type in subscribed to channel, and we want to set the subscribed to channel to the subscribed to channel that's passed in. Try saying that 10 times fast. Now we can actually use the try catch down here in order to try to update our user. We of course want to catch that error. And inside of here, all we're going to do is we want to say this is going to be our updated subscriber. Subscriber is going to be equal to await res.subscriber, which is going to get our subscriber. And again, we're going to use that save function. So this is going to give us the updated version of our subscriber if they successfully saved. And then of course we can use res.json here in order to send back that updated subscriber. And if we have an error, we can set the status here equal to 400 because again, if the users pass in like a name that's not acceptable or a subscribed to channel that's not acceptable, that's their fault and not ours. So we want to make sure we send a 400 error instead of a 500. And we want to send in a message, which is just going to be error.message. So now we can actually try testing that. But before we do that, you can see we get an error and it says await is only valid in async functions. So we need to just make sure that this is an asynchronous function. And now everything's green, which is perfect. We can come in here. Let's just copy this delete for now, put in the 3 hashtags, and we can just say here, we want to do a patch, and we want to patch this user. We want to send application.json as our content type, just like here. And let's say we want to change the name. So we're going to set the name here to new name. And now if we actually send this request, you'll see that it says it cannot find the subscriber with this ID, and that's because this ID no longer exists. So let's get a new ID from our currently existing subscriber. You see their name is Amazing Person. So we'll copy that ID, paste it down here in our patch, and we'll send that request. And you'll see we get back a new object here, which is the updated object, and it has that new name. And now if we query all of our subscribers, you see this subscriber now has the name of new name, and that's it. The entire REST API is complete. If you want to go deeper into Node.js and Express, make sure to check out my completely free full stack course on YouTube, which is linked over here. Also, subscribe to the channel to not miss any more videos like this. Thank you all very much for watching and have a good day.